For years, the Wayans brothers made it feel like laughter was effortless, like nothing behind the scenes could ever go wrong. But once the cameras stopped rolling, the real stories didn't stay that simple. Some rose higher, some quietly disappeared, and some faced moments no one saw coming. So, what really happened after the laughs ended? First up, Shawn Wayans as Sean Williams, a lead who never played by sitcom rules. In his early 20s, he felt less like an actor and more like himself on screen, reacting, joking, living every moment. His natural chemistry with Marlon Wayans became the core of the Wayans brothers, making it seem like he had found his perfect place, at least for a while. Then the show ended in 1999, suddenly, without a real farewell. Years later, that frustration quietly resurfaced in an unexpected way, in a scene from Scary Movie where his character breaks the fourth wall and calls out the lack of closure. It didn't feel like a joke. It felt like something unresolved finally slipping through. And yet, despite that awkward ending, Shawn didn't slow down right away. The early 2000s became his real peak. Scary Movie exploded at the box office, White Chicks in 2004 turned into a cult classic, and Little Man followed in 2006. For a moment, it looked like he had fully transitioned from sitcom star to comedy powerhouse. But then, the momentum didn't continue the way people expected. There wasn't a dramatic fall, no scandal-dominating headlines, just a quiet pullback. Fewer appearances, fewer major projects. Fans started to notice the absence more than the presence. Even mainstream coverage years later, including reflections in outlets like the Los Angeles Times, circled back to the same question. Why did someone so visible at his peak choose to step away from that level of exposure? And maybe that's what makes Shawn Wayans different from most stories in Hollywood. He didn't crash. He didn't fade because he had to. He simply stopped chasing the spotlight the way others did. As of 2026, he's still alive, still connected to the Wayans legacy, occasionally appearing in projects, but never quite returning to that same relentless visibility. And maybe that's the real twist. Not every story ends with a fall. Sometimes it's a quiet decision to walk away while the laughter is still echoing. And if Shawn felt like the one who quietly stepped back, Marlon Wayans moved in the opposite direction, louder, faster, and far more unpredictable. When he first appeared as Marlon Williams, he was just around 23, younger, sharper, and almost impossible to contain on screen. Where Shawn grounded the show, Marlon disrupted it. His energy felt chaotic in the best way, turning even simple scenes into something that looked unscripted. Through the early 2000s, that momentum turned into something bigger. Scary Movie helped redefine parody for a new generation, and White Chicks in 2004 became one of those films people kept quoting years later. But what's more interesting isn't just the success, it's how he kept shifting. By the 2000s and into the 2020s, Marlon wasn't just chasing laughs anymore. In interviews and on stage, especially during his Amazon special Good Grief, there are moments where the performance breaks, where the jokes stop landing as jokes and start feeling like something else entirely. That moment makes more sense when you understand what was happening off stage. In a 2024 interview covered by People, Marlon spoke about losing nearly 60 loved ones between 2020 and 2023, including both of his parents, just 3 years apart. He described his mother's passing as a breaking point, something that left him in pieces. For a while, even his physical state reflected that weight, but instead of disappearing, he leaned into it, turning grief into material, into something shared. Not polished, not distant, just real. And maybe that's the difference between the two brothers. Where one quietly stepped away, Marlon stayed in front of the audience, but changed what he showed them. Now, in 2026, he's still active, still performing, still evolving. Not just trying to be funny anymore, but trying to mean something when he is. And just when the energy felt unpredictable, There was one person who kept everything grounded: John Witherspoon. When he stepped into the Wayans brothers as Pops, he was about 53, playing the father who didn't just react to the chaos, he controlled it. Loud, sharp, and always a step ahead, his presence made the comedy feel anchored, not scattered. What followed wasn't a rise or a fall, it was continuity. Around the same era and beyond, Friday turned him into a cultural staple, and that voice, that timing, stayed recognizable for decades. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, he kept showing up, in stand-up, in voice work, in small but memorable roles, never disappearing, never chasing reinvention either, just working. The twist is how that consistency came with pressure people didn't always see. In later coverage reflected by outlets like the New York Times, he spoke candidly about still performing in his late 70s because he had to, supporting family, staying active, not slowing down. It reframes those final years. Not a legend coasting, but someone still carrying responsibility. On October 29, 2019, John Witherspoon died at 77, with cardiac arrest reported as the cause. In the show, Pops was the one holding the family together through noise and chaos. And off-screen, right up until the end, John Witherspoon was doing something very similar, showing up, working, and holding his world together without making a spectacle of it. There was a time when being everywhere didn't mean being remembered. Anna Maria Horsford lived right inside that space. When she appeared as Dee Baxter, she was already in her late 40s, not trying to compete with the chaos, but quietly controlling it. Her presence didn't demand attention, it redirected it. And that difference is easy to miss until you realize how rare it is. Long before that, Amen, 1986 to 1991, had already made her a familiar face across American television. Not a breakout moment, but a long, steady run that built recognition the slow way. The kind of career that should have led to bigger, more central roles. But it didn't. As the industry shifted into the 2000s, something changed. Not dramatically, not publicly, just enough to alter the trajectory. The roles kept coming, but they moved further from the center. Not less work, just less visibility. Over time, she became one of those actors everyone recognizes, but no one immediately places. And that's the twist. Because unlike the others, she didn't fall. She didn't disappear. She stayed, consistently, quietly, through projects like The Bold and the Beautiful, and later, The Resident. Always present. Rarely the focus. By 2026, Anna Maria Horsford is in her late 70s and still working. And maybe her story answers the question in a different way. After the laughs, not every career breaks. Some just keep going, long after the spotlight has moved on. At one point, Layla Rochon didn't just enter the spotlight, she fit it perfectly. And that's what makes what came next harder to ignore. When she appeared on the Wayans brothers as Lisa, she was in her early 30s, already carrying the momentum of Waiting to Exhale, 1995, a film that didn't just succeed, it defined a moment. For a while, everything about her trajectory felt aligned. Visibility, recognition, timing. Then, years later, her name returned to headlines for something else entirely. In 2019, images of her husband, director Antoine Fuqua, with another woman began circulating online, quickly picked up by entertainment media outlets. The shift was immediate, not because of something she did, but because of how public it became. And almost as quickly she disappeared from view, her social media gone, her presence reduced to silence. That silence didn't last forever. When she returned, it wasn't through an interview or a statement, it was visual, red carpets, public appearances, and one detail people noticed instantly. She was still wearing her wedding ring. No explanation, no defense, just a decision to move forward without turning the moment into a narrative. As of 2026, Layla Rochon is in her early 60s, still active, including her return in Coming to America, 2021. And maybe that's the real shift here. On screen, she was part of a story that looked certain. Off-screen, what came after wasn't about certainty at all. It was about what you choose to carry. When everyone is watching, not every breakout moment turns into a steady career, and Paula Jai Parker's story makes that clear almost immediately. When she appeared during the Wayans brothers' era in the mid-1990s, she was in her late 20s, taking on smaller roles but leaving a sharp impression. Around the same time, Friday, 1995, made her widely recognizable, and a decade later, Hustle and Flow, 2005, a film that won the Academy Award for Best Original Song, reinforced her presence in a different kind of story. By the early 2000s, her visibility had dropped in a way that didn't match her earlier trajectory. In 2014, on the reality series Hollywood Divas, she revealed that she, her husband, and their son had been living in extended-stay hotels due to financial hardship, a moment that played out publicly, not as a headline, but as part of her own account. Around that same period, in multiple interviews, she also spoke about feeling blackballed after her marriage and pregnancy, describing how work and representation seemed to disappear almost at once. Entertainment outlets and coverage around the show picked up those statements, turning them into a wider conversation about how quickly careers can shift in Hollywood. What adds another layer is that her struggles weren't only professional. In past interviews, she has spoken openly about early childhood trauma and family instability, experiences she later described as shaping how she moved through both life and the industry. It doesn't simplify the story, but it gives it context. Still, she didn't vanish. In the years that followed, she reappeared in projects like True Blood and later returned to voice acting with The Proud Family, Louder and Prouder, showing that even after a long disruption, she remained connected to the work. Paula Jai Parker is 57 years old in 2026. She is still active, continuing to take on roles across television and voice projects. And in a story filled with laughter, hers is one of the paths that didn't follow the script. Building on the energy of Paula Jai Parker, the spotlight then shifts to Mitch Mullaney, who, in his mid-20s, played White Mike on the Wayans brothers, an offbeat outsider whose intentionally awkward rhythm made him stand out by never quite fitting in. For a moment, that presence turned into something bigger. By the late 1990s, he landed his own series, Nick Freno, Licensed Teacher, 1996 to 1998, a rare jump from supporting roles to leading man on network television. It looked like the next step had already been secured. But it didn't hold. After the show ended, the momentum slowed instead of building. Appearances became less frequent, and the industry moved on faster than his trajectory could recover. What followed wasn't public drama. It was distance. In later reflections and smaller media mentions around his passing, the tone wasn't about controversy, but about absence. Work had become inconsistent. Visibility had faded. And by the mid-2000s, he was largely out of the spotlight without a clear return. At just 39 years old, Mitch Mullaney passed away in Los Angeles on May 25, 2008, with reports later confirming that a diabetes-related stroke was the cause. On screen, White Mike was always slightly disconnected from everything happening around him. And in real life, by the time he was gone, it felt like the world had already moved on in the same quiet way. Born in 1932, Jeanette Dubois stepped into the role of Grandma Ellington on the Wayans brothers in her early 50s, bringing with her a lifetime of stage and screen experience. She didn't need to command attention. It was already there in her voice, her rhythm, and the quiet authority she carried into every line. Long before that, her defining moment had already happened. In the 1970s, Good Times made her a household name as Willona Woods, a role that stretched across years and became part of television history. And beyond acting, her voice reached even further. The theme song of The Jeffersons, Movin' On Up, became one of the most recognizable openings in TV, a piece of work that outlived any single role. What's striking is how steady her career remained. Through the 1980s, 90s, and into the 2000s, she continued appearing across television and voice acting, including projects like The PJs, where her performance earned Emmy recognition. There wasn't a collapse, no sudden disappearance, just a long, consistent presence that adapted as the industry changed. On February 17, 2020, Jeanette Dubois died at her home in Glendale, California, at the age of 74, with cardiac arrest reported as the cause. In The Wayans brothers, she played a grandmother figure who seemed to understand everything happening around her without needing to say much. And in real life, Jeanette Dubois built a career that moved the same way. Not always loud, not always in front, but always there, shaping the space around her. Not every member of the Wayans family chased the same kind of spotlight. Kim Wayans stepped into it, and then quietly stepped sideways. When she appeared on The Wayans brothers as Sheila, she was around 35, already carrying years of experience from In Living Color, where her performances stood out for precision more than chaos. She wasn't trying to compete with the loudest energy in the room. She understood how to control it, and that difference was already visible. At a time when the Wayans brand was dominating broad comedy, Kim didn't follow that wave. She moved in the opposite direction, into smaller, more serious roles that didn't guarantee visibility. That decision became clear with Pariah in 2011. The film didn't explode commercially, but it earned critical recognition, including nominations from the Black Reel Awards and the NAACP Image Awards. While her brothers stayed highly visible in mainstream comedy, Kim's path made her less present in pop culture conversation. Not because she disappeared, but because she chose projects that didn't keep her constantly in front of the audience. In later interviews and appearances, she spoke about writing, creating, and focusing on work that felt more personal, including her children's book, Amy Hodgepodge. It reframes her career in a different way, not a rise and fall, but a deliberate shift away from the expected path. Born in 1961, Kim Wayans is 65 in 2026 and still active creatively. And maybe that's the real twist. In a family known for chasing laughs at full speed, she slowed down and built something that didn't depend on staying in the spotlight to last. When Phil Lewis appeared on The Wayans brothers as TC in 1995, he was 27, playing a slick, unpredictable hustler who always seemed one step ahead, the kind of presence that didn't need screen time to leave an impression. But even before and after that, his career was already in motion. In the early 90s, he had landed a lead role in Teach, and throughout the decade he kept showing up across television, building a steady presence. Then years later, he reached a completely different audience with The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, where Mr. Mosby turned him into a recognizable face for an entire new generation. The twist in his story doesn't come after success. It comes before most of it. In late 1991, Phil Lewis was involved in a car crash that killed a young woman. He was charged with manslaughter and driving under the influence, with his blood alcohol level reported at 3 times the legal limit. He was sentenced to prison, with most of the sentence suspended after he participated in outreach programs warning about the consequences of substance abuse. That moment could have ended everything. And for a while it did pause his trajectory. But what followed is what makes his story different. He returned, not immediately to leading roles, but steadily, rebuilding piece by piece until he reached a point where audiences knew him again, this time in a completely different light. As of 2026, he is 58, still alive, still working as an actor and television director. And maybe his story answers the question in a way most don't. Sometimes, What happens after the laughs is accountability and the long road back from it. But not every comeback finds its footing. Jermaine Hopkins's story moves in a very different direction. He was only about 22 when he took on the role of Dupree in the Wayans brothers, bringing the same raw, street-level energy audiences had already seen in Lean on Me, 1989, and later Juice, 1992. Back then, it felt like he was part of a wave, young actors who could move between drama and comedy without losing authenticity. The momentum was real, but it didn't hold. By the 2000s, his presence on screen had already slowed, and then the shift became public for a different reason. On December 15, 2011, Hopkins was arrested after attempting to purchase a large quantity of marijuana from an undercover officer, a case later documented in court records and widely reported. He faced serious charges, but ultimately received a short jail sentence and probation. It wasn't a career-ending headline by itself, but it marked a clear break from where things once seemed headed. In October 2017, he was arrested in Apex, North Carolina, after police found several pounds of marijuana in his vehicle, a case covered by local outlets like ABC 11. He later pleaded guilty to possession, with the court suspending a longer sentence in favor of supervised probation. Two incidents, years apart, but pointing in the same direction. That's where the pattern becomes hard to ignore. The early promise never fully disappeared, but it kept getting interrupted. Jermaine Hopkins, born in 1973, is 53 in 2026 and still alive. But when you look back, the question from the title lands differently. After the laughs, after the early roles, after the momentum, what remains isn't just what he achieved, but how close it all came to going another way. Sherry Headley's story begins long before the Wayans brothers, and that's what makes her shift harder to ignore. When she appeared as Dawn, she was around 31, already known to audiences as Lisa McDowell from Coming to America, 1988. A role that helped define her early career and turned her into a recognizable face almost overnight. That momentum carried into the early 90s, especially with All My Children, 1991 to 1994, where she earned NAACP Image Award nominations. Not massive headlines, but clear industry respect. But the turning point didn't come from acting. In 1993, she married Christopher "Play" Martin at the height of her visibility. By June 1995, the marriage was over, short, abrupt, and followed by a quieter but more complicated chapter. In 2001, court rulings reported by outlets like the New York Post confirmed that Martin had been ordered to resume child support payments with tens of thousands of dollars in arrears tied to their son. It wasn't a scandal in the explosive sense, but it was public, documented, and persistent enough to follow her name beyond her roles. The career didn't disappear. She continued working in projects like The Preacher's Wife, 1996, Johnson Family Vacation, 2004, and later The Haves and the Have-Nots, 2014 to 2016, but the narrative around her changed. Not driven by headlines, but by the kind of personal reality that doesn't fade as quickly as a film credit. Born in 1964, Sherry Headley is 62 in 2026 and still active, including her return in Coming to America, 2021. And maybe that's the contrast that stays with you. On screen, Lisa McDowell was part of a love story that felt clean and certain. In real life, her story after the spotlight became something far less predictable and much harder to control. At just 25, Anthony Anderson popped up on the Wayans brothers in 1995 in blink and you miss it roles, like a man in a jail cell or a party extra, hardly drawing much attention back then. But within a few years, that changed fast. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, he began landing larger roles in films like Life, 1999, and Barbershop, 2002, building toward a different level of visibility. Then came Blackish in 2014, the role that redefined everything. Over multiple seasons, his performance as Dre Johnson earned consistent Emmy nominations, turning him from a recognizable actor into a leading name on network television. In 2004, a woman accused Anderson and an assistant director of sexual assault on the set of Hustle and Flow. The case was later dismissed due to insufficient evidence, as reported by multiple outlets. Years later, in 2018, another allegation was reported to the LAPD, but prosecutors declined to file charges, a decision covered by outlets including Yahoo. Throughout both situations, Anderson denied the accusations. At the same time, his personal life was under strain. His wife of over 2 decades filed for divorce in 2014 and again in 2022, with proceedings that played out publicly in entertainment media, including coverage from The Hollywood Reporter. Even in 2024, reports surfaced of him being hospitalized after an on-set accident, adding another layer to an already complicated timeline. At 56 in 2026, Anthony Anderson, born in 1970, remains active in front of and behind the camera. And perhaps it's that balance that truly defines his journey. On the Wayans brothers, he was just a background presence, someone easy to miss. In real life, everything that followed made him impossible to ignore, for better and at times for more complicated reasons. They made us laugh like nothing could ever break behind the scenes, but now you've seen what really came after. Some rose, some struggled, some disappeared, and some carried more than anyone ever noticed. So tell me, which story stayed with you the most, and who should we uncover next?